It's 1999. Lap 36. Rubens Barrichello is doing 185 miles per hour down the straight at Spa-Francorchamps. He checks his mirror. Schumacher is there. Not close. Not pressuring him. Just there. And Barrichello would later say, and these are his exact words, "I felt cold. Not from the speed, not from the rain, from the mirror." To understand what made Michael Schumacher terrifying, you have to understand something first. It wasn't the speed. Every driver on that grid was fast. They were the best human beings on Earth at controlling a machine at the absolute edge of physics. Speed was the baseline. What Schumacher did was something else entirely. Damon Hill, 1996. World champion, one of the most composed drivers in Formula One history, once sat down after a race and tried to explain what racing Schumacher felt like. He said, "You'd be having a normal race, thinking clearly, managing your tires, following your strategy, and then you'd see him in your mirror, and something would shift, like your brain knew something your conscious mind hadn't caught up with yet. That shift, that irrational, physical, involuntary shift, that's what we're talking about today. Because here's what the history books don't capture, what the lap times don't show. Michael Schumacher was running a psychological operation, and he started it before he ever climbed into the car. Jacques Villeneuve was the 1997 world champion, confident, outspoken, unapologetically fearless. He was not a man who scared easily. But during the 1997 season, a season that came down to a single championship battle between him and Schumacher, he described something that has stuck with journalists for over 2 decades. He said Schumacher had a way of looking at you in the pre-race driver's briefing. Not aggressive, not threatening, analytical, like you were a problem he'd already solved. Villeneuve said, "You could feel him measuring you. He wasn't watching you, he was reading you. And the worst part, he wanted you to notice." That was the first layer. Make them feel studied. But Schumacher didn't invent psychological warfare in Formula One. Senna did it before him. Prost was a master of the political game. What made Schumacher different was the precision. Former Ferrari technical director Ross Brawn, the man who built championship cars around him, once said something revealing. He said that Schumacher's preparation wasn't just physical or mechanical. It was psychological projection. Before every race, Schumacher would sit with his engineers, and they wouldn't just talk about tire strategies and fuel loads. They would talk about his opponents' minds. Which driver was under pressure? Who'd had a bad qualifying? Who'd argued with their team that morning? Who was trying to prove something? Schumacher would file all of it away, and then he'd use it. Precisely. Surgically. At exactly the right moment. So let's talk about the methods, because what the legends describe isn't some vague aura of dominance. It was a system, and it had distinct components. The first, the qualifying lap. In Formula One, qualifying determines your grid position. It's 1 lap. Maximum commitment. You leave everything on the track. But the drivers who raced against Schumacher in the late 90s and early 2000s described the same phenomenon, over and over. They'd put in what they thought was the lap of their life. Heart pounding. They'd come over the radio to their engineers and ask, "How does it look?" And the engineer would go quiet for just a second too long, because Schumacher had already gone faster, not by a little, often by half a second, 3/4 of a second, sometimes more. In Formula One, that is not a small margin. David Coulthard described the psychological effect of that pattern accumulating over a season. He said, "After a while, you'd almost stop believing you could beat him in qualifying. And that belief, or lack of it, that's already a defeat. He'd taken something from you before the race even started." The lap time was the result. The psychological erosion was the weapon. The second method, the slow burn. Schumacher never needed to be immediately aggressive with most rivals. He was patient in a way that was almost inhuman. Mika Häkkinen, two-time world champion, the closest thing to a genuine equal Schumacher had in that era, described races where Schumacher would sit behind him, not attacking, not making a move, just following, lap after lap, close enough to fill your mirrors, close enough that you'd know he was there, even when you couldn't see him. Häkkinen said, "You'd start asking yourself, why isn't he attacking? What does he know that I don't? Is there something wrong with my car? Is this a trap?" And the moment you started asking those questions, the moment your focus fractured, that was the moment Schumacher wanted. Because doubt, in a Formula One car at 200 miles per hour, is catastrophic. The third method, the move that wasn't a move. In wheel-to-wheel racing, drivers learn to read each other's body language through the car itself. The way you position the vehicle, left, right, early, late, telegraphs your intentions. Schumacher had an almost supernatural ability to fake those telegraphs. He'd position his car as if setting up for one corner and pivot instantly for another. He'd make a half move, just enough to flinch his opponent, and then not take it. Rubens Barrichello, who was his teammate for years at Ferrari and knows his driving as well as any human alive, put it this way: Michael could make you think he was going right. He could make you feel it. And by the time you responded, he was already somewhere you didn't expect. He wasn't just driving the car, he was driving you. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. All of the methods we've described, the qualifying dominance, the slow burn, the phantom moves, these are tactics. Brilliant, calculated tactics. What the legends describe next is something else, something that goes beyond tactics. Eddie Irvine raced alongside Schumacher at Ferrari from 1996 to 1999. He was fierce himself, aggressive, quick, almost reckless in his bravery. He once gave an interview where he said something that stopped the journalist cold. He said, "The thing about Michael that people don't understand is that he didn't just want to win. He wanted to know that you knew he was going to win. Before the race, he wanted that certainty to exist in your head, and he was very good at putting it there. He wanted that certainty to exist in your head. This is not a driver talking about speed or strategy. This is a driver describing something closer to behavioral conditioning." Damon Hill has spoken about what it was like to be the primary target of that conditioning. Hill is a reserved man, thoughtful, careful with his words, which is why what he described is so striking. He said there came a point in 1994 where he began to dread certain corners, not because of the physical danger, not because of car setup, but because he knew Schumacher would be there, and that knowing, that certainty of Schumacher's presence, changed how Hill drove those corners. He wasn't responding to what Schumacher was doing. He was responding to what he expected Schumacher might do. Hill was, in a very real psychological sense, being driven by an opponent who wasn't even beside him yet. That is the apex of the mind game. And then there is Jerez, 1997, final race, championship on the line. Villeneuve on what happened in the moment of contact, not the politics, not the penalty, the moment, said, "I think he believed he could make me back off. He'd done it to others. He understood how people respond under pressure. In that second, he calculated wrong, but the calculation itself, that he could use that moment to make me make a decision, that tells you everything." Even there, even then, championship deciding speed, everything on the line, Schumacher was still running the psychological math. Now here's the part they don't talk about at the podium, the part that only comes out years later, in quiet interviews, in the candid admissions of men who've had time to process what they experienced. The psychological warfare didn't end when the car stopped. Schumacher was disarmingly charming off the track. He'd talk to you in the paddock, warmly, normally, about your family, about nothing in particular. And you'd come away feeling like you'd had a perfectly normal conversation with a perfectly normal person. And then the helmet went on. Coulthard described it as, you'd think, okay, we're professionals, we understand each other. And then, on lap 1, he'd put you on the grass at 170 miles per hour without a second of hesitation. You were just data. Just data. Häkkinen, who genuinely beat him, who took 2 championships from him, said something in retirement that gets to the heart of it. When I beat Michael, I felt like I'd solved something incredibly difficult. When he beat me, I felt like I'd been taken apart by someone who understood something about me I didn't understand myself. One of the greatest drivers in Formula One history, world champion, feeling taken apart by a man who knew his limits better than he did. For years, the picture was this: a coldly calculating man running psychological operations on his opponents, engineered from the outside, ruthless in its precision. But here's what shifted everything. In the years since his retirement, the people on the other side of that Ferrari radio, the engineers, the strategists, have described something that fundamentally reframes what we thought we knew. Ross Brawn said that during the most intense moments of a race, wheel-to-wheel battles, critical overtaking windows, the moments when every other driver's voice on the radio was clipped and urgent, Schumacher's voice was slower than normal, not urgent, not clipped, slower, more deliberate, as if the compression of time that every driver experiences under pressure worked differently for him, as if the world was moving at half speed inside that cockpit. And that's when the real picture comes into focus. The mind game that all these legends experienced, the calculated presence, the patient pressure, the phantom moves, the certainty he projected. It wasn't theater. It wasn't performance. It was simply what Schumacher actually experienced inside a racing car. While every other driver on that grid was operating at the outer edge of their cognitive capacity, adrenaline spiking, instincts blurring into reaction, Schumacher had mental bandwidth left over. He wasn't playing mind games with them. He was just thinking. Clearly. Completely. In the middle of something that was cognitively overwhelming everyone around him. And the terror they felt in those mirrors, that was them sensing, without being able to explain it, that the person behind them wasn't operating under the same rules. The greatest drivers in Formula One history, men who went to the edge of human capability every single weekend. They have all said some version of the same thing about Michael Schumacher. That racing him felt different, that his presence in a mirror changed something in the air, that winning against him felt less like victory and more like an anomaly. We talk about his 7 world championships, his 91 race wins, his records. But what the numbers don't capture, what only the men who shared that track with him can tell you, is what it felt like to be in those mirrors, to be studied, measured, predicted, and then, inevitably, surpassed. Not because he was in a better car, not always, but because he was in a different kind of mind. Eddie Irvine, his teammate, his friend, a man who saw him more closely than almost anyone, was asked once, "Was Michael Schumacher the most complete driver you ever saw?" And Irvine laughed, and then he went quiet, and he said, "Complete? No. Complete suggests there was nothing missing. Michael wasn't complete. He was something else. Something we don't quite have a word for yet."